A little boy was deceived onto a car by this man, and a few hours later, the man emerged from the woods covered in blood, only to be spotted by a little girl. The next day, the police found the boy lying in the woods, having been sexually assaulted before his death, with his organs cruelly devoured. All eyewitnesses, surveillance footage, and fingerprints pointed to one man, the elementary school's PE teacher, Terry. No one had expected that the usually genteel man would be a pervert. The residents of the small town, realizing their children had been in his company daily, were consumed with anger. Even Terry's wife and 2 daughters became social pariahs. The case seemed closed, but unexpectedly, Terry claimed he was at a meeting 100 kilometers away on the day of the incident. His lawyer even produced interview footage from a local TV station, showing Terry at the meeting. The police were baffled. How could one person be in 2 different places simultaneously? Detective Ralph investigated around the meeting location and confirmed Terry's presence from a bookstore owner who remembered she browsing a niche book but not purchasing it due to its high price. Ralph took the book, collected Terry's fingerprint from it, and found it to match the one at the crime scene. The police and the medical examiner were stunned. This was the most bizarre case they had ever encountered. Remembering Terry's consistently innocent demeanor, Ralph began to doubt. Meanwhile, Terry, unable to post bail, suffered humiliation in jail. Ralph, at his wits' end, had to re-examine the evidence. He found 2 eyewitnesses, a child and a person with nearsightedness. Could there be any deviation in their testimonies? But the surveillance footage depicted Terry's actions clearly. Covered in blood, he entered a bar to use the restroom, then took a taxi home. Ralph felt that something was amiss but couldn't articulate it. It wasn't until he zoomed in on the footage and saw Terry flipping off the camera that he realized the man had intentionally appeared under surveillance. Why would he do that? More forensic evidence emerged. Several days after the incident, partially extracted fluids were found on Terry's clothes and belt. Initially thought to be Terry's bodily fluids, analysis revealed they were not human in origin. Additionally, the fingerprints on the belt were noticeably blurred compared to previous prints, a characteristic typically seen in the elderly. What did this signify? Unfortunately, time waits for no one, and some clues were insufficient to overturn the charges. The trial date arrived swiftly. Faced with such bizarre evidence, how would the judge rule? However, Terry did not wait for that moment. Outside the courtroom, a young man suddenly appeared and shot at Terry. Ralph quickly drew his weapon and returned fire, resulting in the young man being fatally shot. Terry was hit in a vital area, barely clinging to life, repeatedly insisting he did not kill the boy before being rushed to the ICU. No one at the scene noticed a man with a twisted face wearing a green cap coldly observing from the crowd. That night, Terry's young daughter suddenly woke up and claimed she saw a figure who told her that her father was dead. In the following days, she kept staring at a corner of the room, seemingly frightened by something invisible until she screamed abruptly. One day, she told her mother about the person who informed her of her father's death. The next day, her father, who had been shot and hospitalized, succumbed to his injuries. A few days later, the girl told her mother, "Can you call the police officer who's investigating Dad's case? That person has something he wants me to tell him." To comfort her daughter, her mother reluctantly called Ralph. The girl told Ralph, "That person asked me to tell you not to investigate my dad's case anymore, or something bad will happen." Ralph asked her if he had said what kind of bad thing. This line of questioning upset the girl's mother, Glory. Just as she was about to take her daughter away, she was stopped by Ralph's wife. She said, "We need to guide her properly to comfort her. I have more experience with this." So Glory allowed her to take over. Jeannie asked the girl what the person looked like. The girl replied, "At first, he looked just like my dad, but I knew he wasn't my dad because his skin was different from my dad's, and he's really bad. He wants me to cry." The second time he came, he didn't look as much like Dad, and he was dressed really sloppily. After that, his face became blurry, like it had been erased. Jeannie reassured her, "Well, since you've delivered the message, he surely won't come again." The girl said, "He's already gone." In fact, all the adults present believed the little girl was either dreaming or hallucinating. The atheist Ralph was especially unconcerned and continued with his investigation. However, that very night, Jeannie woke up to drink some water. When she turned around, she saw a dark figure in the dining room, and she was so frightened that she dropped her glass. The next moment, she walked toward the figure as if she had lost all sense of awareness, not even feeling the glass shards piercing her feet. The man got closer to Jeannie and said, "Tell your husband to stop, or you will all die." The next day, Ralph saw the glass shards and blood on the floor. Then he noticed his wife's injured feet. Ralph was puzzled as to why his wife could sleep through all this, while Jeannie seemed so distant and preoccupied. After some hesitation, Jeannie finally told her husband about what had happened the previous night. She hoped that her husband would stop investigating the case, but Ralph believed Jeannie was sleepwalking, because when they had suffered the pain of losing their child, Jeannie often sleepwalked. He advised his wife to take some medicine and then continue with the investigation, but Jeannie took out some paper and a pen. She wanted to draw the person. On Ralph's side, he finally found the latest eyewitness. The boy had seen the driver of the car used in the crime, but when Ralph asked if the boy had clearly seen the person's face, the boy said no. However, after a series of inner struggles, the boy agreed to try and draw the person's face. Ralph brought the boy's drawing home and saw the drawing his wife had left behind. He fell silent. The two drawings looked eerily similar. When Jeannie came home and saw it, she was astonished. The next day, she went to Glory's house. After carefully questioning the little girl, she drew the different versions of the person's appearance over time. Though Glory was very upset by this, Jeannie couldn't care less. At this point, she almost believed that the thing was real. She was terrified her husband might get hurt. Ralph then went to Glory's house again because, after his investigation, he believed that the person had followed them when Glory's family went on vacation to Dayton a month ago. Ralph asked Glory if anything special had happened at that time. Glory couldn't remember anything significant. The family had mostly stayed in the hotel. However, the little girl said, "No, that's not right. Dad's hand was injured. He went to visit Grandpa in the nursing home, and when he came back, his wrist was scratched." In response to this, Ralph's colleague decided to ask for help from someone named Holly Gibney, a person with an almost mythical reputation in the detective world. She had extraordinary perceptive abilities. She could look at any car on the street and, in just 3 seconds, tell its model, horsepower, production year, and other parameters. She could glance at a building and identify its height with a margin of error of less than 6 centimeters. More importantly, when standing at a crime scene, she could imagine what had happened using her sixth sense and then conduct a targeted investigation. Thus, with everyone's expectations, she arrived in Dayton. However, that night, the firm atheist Ralph turned around and saw his long-dead son. Do people really have doppelgangers? This woman explained that those who experienced doppelgangers all had parents who once said something to them in their childhood. They were kind-hearted and gentle people, but one day, someone who looked exactly like them appeared. These doppelgangers were child killers, extremely cruel, and they would even eat the children's internal organs. The police are at their wits' end with this unprecedented case and have to pin their hopes on private detectives. However, when she arrived, it was already a month later. The surveillance footage was long gone, but she didn't care. She went to a nursing home, initially wanting to find Terry's father, but the staff, after a few more questions from her, kicked her out, saying that only Terry could visit. It turned out that she had mistaken Holly for a reporter. The sensitive Holly guessed that she must be covering up some other scandal, not the Terry case, because she had no idea that Terry was already dead. Sure enough, Holly discovered from local news that a caregiver here had sexually assaulted and murdered 2 young girls. The method was eerily similar to the Terry case, and this caregiver, client, also had a doppelganger. This meant that the 2 cases were strikingly similar, with the key detail being that the timeline was just a few days after Terry had left Dayton. Could there be a connection between the 2? However, client didn't give Holly the opportunity to investigate further. That night, he suddenly slit his throat and committed suicide in prison. With no other choice, Holly had to wait until her off hours to find the female caregiver again. Unexpectedly, the caregiver, mistaking Holly for a stalker, sprayed her face with pepper spray. Luckily, after understanding the situation, the caregiver took her back to her home and explained the story about client. She said that day, client, who was supposed to be on vacation, suddenly appeared at the nursing home. She noticed that client seemed different, speaking very little compared to usual, and Terry's father was officially under client's management, and Terry happened to be at the nursing home that day as well. It was clear that Terry's hand had been scratched by client. As for what happened next, when client killed the 2 little girls, the caregiver was deeply confused. However, client's mother said that client had been by her side all the time and had never left. Holly was almost certain that this case had a huge connection with the Terry case, but was the key really the scratch on the hand? Could that be the means of transmission? Holly then managed to meet Terry's father, but the old man, completely senile, was babbling nonsense and had lost all his faculties. So the investigation had to shift back to client. If client transmitted whatever it was to Terry, then who transmitted it to client? She returned to the caregiver's house and finally got a lead on client's vacation to New York and even found a postcard. Holly immediately went back to search and, sure enough, discovered that during the same time frame and at the same location, a similar murder had occurred. But this time, the murderer was a woman, not a man. So, Holly immediately headed to New York. Here's the full translation of the new section. In prison, Holly saw the female inmate who used to work as a hotel receptionist. She looked at client's photo and said they knew each other, because client had relentlessly pursued her, but she didn't like him and had even stood him up. However, in a corner where the inmate couldn't see, another version of herself hadn't stood client up. Instead, she had breakfast with him, and after they finished, they returned to the hotel room together. During this time, the woman's fingers had scratched client's back. At this point, Holly asked the inmate, "Do you know who the real murderer is?" The inmate replied, "If I tell you, they'll send me to a psychiatric hospital." Just then, visiting hours were over, and the inmate quickly left. However, at the next table, a mysterious woman secretly passed Holly a note. Holly went to the woman's house. This woman, who appeared to be some kind of spiritualist, got straight to the point and asked Holly, "When you were a child, how did your parents scare you when you wouldn't go to sleep?" Holly incredulously asked, "Are you saying this person is a sleep spirit?" The spiritualist replied, "A sleep spirit, a sleep demon, or whatever you call it. Your parents would say if you didn't sleep, the sleep spirit would come and eat you." In truth, as long as people believe in these things, they really do exist. But I have a more accurate name for them, the pain feaster. When children are eaten, the feaster remains nearby, devouring the suffering of the family. Holly remembered the first boy's brother had shot Terry, the father had hanged himself, the mother of the Williams sisters had committed suicide, and client's mother had died in a car crash due to reckless driving. Lastly, the grandfather of the last boy had killed the whole family of the murderer. Looking at this, it seemed that the spiritualist's words made some sense. For someone like Holly, who was extraordinary, she believed it. Afterward, she researched various legends and realized that the case's numerous mysteries could all be explained. But how could she report this to the police who had hired her? Just as she was at the cemetery looking for more clues, a boy caught her attention. After a conversation, she realized that the boy seemed to be admitting that he was responsible for the deaths of the two girls. She wanted to ask for more details, but the boy hurriedly left. She had no choice but to take some photos. The next day, as Holly was about to leave, she ran into the boy who was attempting to shoot a man. The boy dragged it on until the police arrived. Suddenly, he turned and shot at the police, who instantly returned fire and killed him. After his death, the police discovered that his gun had no bullets in it. He had deliberately sought death. What kind of situation makes someone depend on others to end their life? Holly couldn't understand, but she noticed that the boy had blisters all over his neck. The next day, when she returned to Georgia, the officer named Jack who came to pick her up also had blisters on the back of his neck, and his intentions weren't pure. This officer, after urinating in public, had seen something unclean. This was the second crime scene of a murder that had occurred at the barn. When Jack arrived inside, a figure appeared before him. He was so frightened that he dropped his flashlight. He quickly picked it up and drew his gun in defense. But just in the blink of an eye, the figure disappeared. Suddenly, a sharp pain struck the back of his neck, as if something had pierced him fiercely. Then came 2, 3, 4 more sharp stabs. When Jack returned home, he grabbed a mirror to check the back of his neck. His expression was incredibly strange at that moment. What happened next was even more bizarre. It seemed like he had become a servant. Every day, he had to hunt a deer or some other animal and leave it in the woods. Not long after, the animal's corpse would be half devoured. It was as though Jack was feeding some invisible master, and this master seemed to have a peculiar ability to spend Jack's money. Jack would go to the supermarket and buy all sorts of furniture, which he would then send to the woods. But if the master was displeased, Jack would receive punches and kicks. Jack was in agony, but there was nothing he could do. He simply couldn't get rid of that thing. One day, Jack received a new task: to kill Holly. Holly was a special private detective. Through her investigations, she had uncovered many truths about that thing. Jack had been ordered to meet Holly at the station. However, after learning more about Holly, Jack decided not to harm her. He wanted to go back to the police station with her to hear her investigation report. He wanted to see if there was any way he could save himself. At the police station's meeting room, everyone was eagerly awaiting Holly. However, was incredibly nervous on stage. She knew that what she was about to say would be hard for others to understand and might even make her seem insane. She began, "There have been 3 child murders. The first was local. Terry went to Dayton 24 days ago, where he was scratched by another killer. Client had gone to New York 23 days ago. In New York, he met a girl on the same day. The girl also murdered a young boy. There are 2 key similarities in all 3 cases. First, there was DNA and fingerprint evidence left at the crime scenes. Second, at the time of the murders, each person had an alibi, witnesses and video footage proving they were dozens of kilometers away from the crime scenes. In other words, they all had doppelgangers. Furthermore, the 23 or 24-day period was not a coincidence, it was a fixed cycle. That thing spreads through wounds, and in about 24 days, it matures. Once the time is up, committing murder seems to become inevitable. At this point, the crowd was very confused. After all the explanations, the question still remained. What exactly was that thing? Holly took a deep breath and continued. Different civilizations have different names for it: the shapeshifter, the possessor, or the doppelganger. In America, parents often call it the sleep fairy. The room fell silent in disbelief. As children, they had all been scared by their parents, who would warn them that if they didn't sleep, the sleep fairy would come and take them away to eat them. But after all, that was just a myth. The usually composed Holly had just shattered all their preconceived notions. The lawyer quickly escorted Terry's wife out of the room, but Glory said she wanted to hear more. Holly continued, "Our immediate priority is not to trace the source of the infection. That's meaningless, because the source could date back to the beginning of time itself. What we need to do is find the latest infected person and destroy it before it can hurt anyone again." At this point, Glory completely lost her temper. She was there to clear her late husband's name, not to listen to Holly's stories. The report meeting ended in chaos, with people split between belief and disbelief. Jeannie, however, was completely convinced. She asked Holly for more details, but just then, Jack suddenly heard a loud buzzing in his head. Then, he saw 4 large words appear on his left hand. "Stop her." Back at home, Jack's dead mother suddenly appeared before him and began to beat him. This was the punishment for Jack disobeying the orders of that thing. The inner despair was far worse than the physical pain. At this moment, Jack decided to completely obey that thing. He would go after Holly first thing in the morning. Meanwhile, Holly had been invited to stay the night at Jeannie's house. Among this group of people, Ralph was the most skeptical of supernatural phenomena. To convince him, Holly asked Jeannie to bring over some clear tape and colored markers. She then stuck the colored tape onto her phone and activated the flashlight function, shining it onto the dining table and chairs. The area lit up. This was exactly the residue left by that thing, matching what the police had found in the barn. This proved that Jeannie hadn't been hallucinating that night. Something had really entered the house. Ralph, though still stubbornly saying that tests needed to be done to confirm anything, had secretly begun investigating the next sleep fairy after Terry. From surveillance footage at a bar, he saw Terry seemingly grab a man's hand. Meanwhile, Holly was tricked into getting into a car by Jack. What was worse, she noticed the water blisters on the back of Jack's neck, indicating that he had been taken over by something unclean. Then she spotted the gun at his waist, which made her feel even more uneasy. If she didn't act quickly, her fate could be worse than she ever imagined. So, she pretended to go to the bathroom. However, the bathroom window was fixed, and escape was impossible. More importantly, Jack had already grown suspicious and followed her. This morning, Jack woke up on the floor, his room covered in blood, and the furniture was scattered everywhere. He called Holly and said, "I saw something in the barn during my investigation. I didn't know what it was before, but after hearing what you said yesterday, I finally understood. You really should come see it." Holly hurriedly left her house. Meanwhile, Jack loaded the gun with bullets. On their way, Holly began to feel that Jack seemed a bit familiar. To test him, Holly purposely dropped a tissue on the floor. When Jack bent down to pick it up, Holly saw the water blisters on the back of his neck. Holly gasped in horror. She made an excuse to go back and grab something, but Jack forcibly took control of the steering wheel. Meanwhile, Ralph, realizing that Holly was missing, tried calling her but couldn't get through. From a colleague, he learned that Holly and Jack had been spending time together, but Jack's phone was also unreachable. So, Ralph and his team decided to go to Jack's house. Upon entering, they were horrified to see the blood splattered across the walls. They couldn't immediately confirm if the blood was Holly's, so they quickly issued a manhunt for Jack. In the car, Jack got straight to the point, asking Holly, "Why did you choose me?" Jack had listened to Holly's investigative report the most carefully, so he knew exactly what was happening to him. And he also knew that Holly had figured it out. Holly could only tell Jack that he was attracted to pain, that the more miserable a person's life, the more that thing was drawn to them. She comforted Jack, saying they would find a way to solve it. But deep down, she knew there was no solution. In the end, Jack would kill her, so she had no choice but to drive into a gas station, pretending to need to use the bathroom. Holly grabbed her bag, but Jack stopped her. She had to tell him that she was on her period. As soon as she closed the bathroom door, Holly couldn't hold her breath any longer and gasped for air. She opened her bag, checking to make sure her spare key was still there, then attempted to climb out the window, but the window was too sturdy. By then, Jack, still in the car, was becoming impatient. He got out and quietly approached the door. Suddenly, he heard the sound of glass shattering and quickly ran toward the back. Holly opened the door and rushed to the car. Jack had fallen into her trap. As Holly slammed the door shut, Jack rushed over, raising the keys in his hand, signaling that she couldn't escape. Unexpectedly, Holly immediately started the car and stepped on the gas to flee. Jack, frantic, fired his gun madly in pursuit. At this point, he had completely severed ties with humanity. Jack felt desperate. He went into the woods, trying to end his life, but that thing wouldn't let him. Holly didn't blame Jack. She knew that living like this was worse than death for him. At the same time, Holly told everyone that she had always thought that the thing only harmed children, but she had overlooked one detail. The thing also needed to feed during its transitional phases. Perhaps this was Jack's role. Jack had just lost his wife and was vulnerable to being taken advantage of. Moreover, he was a sharpshooter, which made him an ideal candidate to be its gunman. Soon, a photo surfaced, and Ralph was publicly criticized. He had always refused to believe Holly and had concealed the screenshot of Terry scratching Claude. When Jeannie saw the photo, she and Holly scolded Ralph loudly, showing no regard for the bigger picture. If Claude had been infected, it could lead to death. After some discussion, they decided to go after Claude. But Claude, having recently been in poor health, had quit his job at the bar and returned to his hometown. It was possible that it had guided him to lay low. Using the strategy of moving to another place to avoid drawing attention, Claude was arrested by the police. His brother arrived at the station and angrily scolded the unreasonable officers. Using his supposed moral high ground, he spoke loudly, only to be stunned by a taser. It wasn't until officers from another city arrived that they realized the reason for the police actions was to protect his older brother. In 2 days, Claude's doppelganger might appear here and begin slaughtering children. At that point, everything would be blamed on Claude. They asked Claude how he had been feeling recently. Claude was on the verge of tears, finally finding someone to confide in. He had been feeling like there were eyes watching him from every corner. He felt dazed and confused, with drastic changes in his temperament. He could barely recognize himself anymore. Ralph and the others decided to stay at Claude's house, saying it was for his protection. In reality, they wanted to see if Claude's doppelganger would appear. As everything was just their speculation, they kept a close watch on local news. The next day, the police came knocking to arrest Claude. After asking around, they learned that yesterday, a tourist wearing a dog-face mask had tricked a boy into following him by telling him there were saber-toothed tiger claw prints in a cave up ahead. Excited, the boy agreed immediately. Thankfully, the boy's sister recognized her brother wearing the mask and sensed something was wrong. She immediately screamed. The masked man was quickly stopped by the crowd, and the boy's grandfather rushed over and tackled him, saving the boy. Although the masked man escaped in the chaos, someone had managed to capture his face in a photo. The police used that photo to find Claude. At that moment, Ralph completely believed Holly. The thing Holly described was real. It existed, and once the time was right, it would come out to feed. With the alibi provided by Ralph and the other officers, Claude was allowed to stay and was not arrested. Ralph and the others then met with the boy and learned about the characteristics of the cave the masked man had taken him to. Claude's brother, who was familiar with the local terrain, managed to deduce the exact location of the cave. The group then decided to go after the thing. However, since the entity could communicate with Claude's senses sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch, and even thought Holly arranged for a lawyer to temporarily take Claude away. The goal was to keep the entity from learning their plans. However, after they left, the lawyer, not paying attention, caused trouble. Seeing that the crowd was in a frenzy, he thought it necessary to explain the situation to Claude. Then he warned Claude to be careful, and Claude went ballistic. He said, "That thing is in my head right now. You're gonna get them killed telling me that." Lawyer, "Get on the phone and call everyone," but there was no signal in the mountains, and the phones couldn't connect. Helpless, the three of them had no choice but to leave immediately and try to catch up with the others. At this moment, Jack had already set up his gun on the mountain, waiting for the group to arrive. The group drove up the mountain, but as soon as they got out of the car, Alec, who was hiding in the distance, was shot by Jack. Everyone scrambled to take cover. Though they were all police officers, they were powerless to fight back because they knew the one shooting at them was their own colleague Jack, the best marksman in the entire force. He continued to fire multiple shots into Alec, who was lying on the ground. The reason for the merciless killings was the entity in the cave behind Jack, growling loudly. After finding cover, Ralph and the others fired back, but it was futile as they couldn't even see Jack's figure. They tried to call for backup, but the phones had no signal. Ralph had no choice but to attempt negotiating with Jack, but Jack completely ignored him. Just then, unexpected reinforcements arrived. Though they had no idea what was going on, Ralph and the others urgently yelled for them to move forward, but it wasn't until Jack's bullets reached them that they realized what was happening. Seal got out of the car, raised his rifle, and fired courageously. However, Jack took a moment to aim and shot Seal with a single bullet, and he fell to the ground. Claude screamed, rushing over to drag his brother aside. Jack took a sip of his drink, growing more excited as he continued killing. At this time, Holly's boyfriend was preparing to say goodbye to her, worried about Holly coming to help. He rushed to a car, lowered his head, and inserted the key. He knew he had to get to a place with a signal to call for backup, or they would all be waiting to die. But then, there was a loud bang as a bullet shattered the car window. However, it didn't hit him. The car successfully started and began moving, but Jack continued to aim. Holly, anxiously watching her boyfriend, felt like her heart was about to leap out of her chest. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and the car stopped. The silence around them was terrifying. Holly couldn't wait any longer. She rushed to save him. The lawyer blocked her, while Jack aimed at the gas tank and shot twice. The car exploded. Flames instantly engulfed the vehicle, and Holly fell into despair, but also fury. She charged forward and shouted toward Jack.
Tell you to help! Tell you to help!
"I curse you to hell." These words seemed to snap Jack back to reality. At that moment, a rattlesnake appeared, glaring at him, and Jack seemed to become excited. He hoped the rattlesnake would bite him, and sure enough, it did. At the same time, the entity in the cave screamed, seemingly injured, and its control over Jack weakened. Jack staggered toward the others and shot himself in the head, ending his own life. The group narrowly survived, but it was thanks to the rattlesnake. They entered the cave and finally saw the entity with their own eyes. It turned around, and true enough, it looked exactly like Claude. It raised its head and screamed, causing the dirt on the ceiling to fall. With a calm and mocking expression, it told Ralph, "Shoot me, and you'll all die here." Holly asked why it did evil. It responded, "It's like you eating meat. I'm also hungry. I need to live. You eat animals. I eat humans." Holly was furious and asked why it chose children. It replied, "Because children are more delicious." Terry, infuriated, tried to strike it, but Holly stopped him, warning that it was toxic. At that moment, Claude entered and was disgusted by seeing someone who looked exactly like him. He was very agitated, and Holly reminded him not to shoot, or the cave would collapse. Claude glared at the entity, and it closed its eyes, seemingly understanding Claude's thoughts. Sure enough, Claude shot it. Instantly, rocks began to fall from the ceiling. The three of them took cover, and after a moment, everything became quiet. The entity lay motionless on the ground. Claude was injured in the foot, and Holly stabbed the entity in the chest with a knife to ensure it was truly dead. Then, the two of them helped Claude out of the cave. But suddenly, Ralph saw two ghosts blocking their path and immediately stopped. He realized the entity hadn't died completely and that he was now the next Jack. In that instant, Ralph seemed to understand everything about the entity. He said to it, "I know your heart isn't your weak spot. Your brain is. I also know that you're weak right now, so your control over them is fading. I'm going to take advantage of this and end it now." Sure enough, the creature stopped pretending to be dead. It slowly opened its eyes, its appearance constantly shifting, turning everyone in the scene into copies of itself. Ralph grabbed a rock and smashed it into the creature's skull. This time, the sleep demon finally stayed down for good. But now, without the creature to provide evidence, how could they explain all of this to the world? so Ralph started coaching the others on what to say. Here's the cover-up they agreed on. Alec and Claude both received anonymous phone calls, which is what led everyone to the woods. This explained how they all ended up there. Why did they receive the anonymous calls? Because Claude had approached Alec earlier, saying he had seen someone who looked very much like Terry, and suspected that the real killer might not be Terry. This information had somehow reached Jack, who was under the influence of the so-called mysterious man who resembled Terry. So, Jack and the mysterious figure conspired to make the anonymous calls, leading Alec and Claude to the woods and triggering the gunfight. With this story, everything was explained, and Terry's innocence was cleared. Furthermore, Jack and Alec's testimonies would have no way of being disproven, and everything could be neatly explained if Claude just told the right lie. Actually, the entire story from when Ralph saw the ghost was something I personally pieced together, because the original film was really hard to follow. For such a dedicated explanation, don't you guys want to hit like and follow? And so, this concludes the explanation of The Outsider. I'm a movie lover. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.